All right, welcome everyone. We're going to call the school board meeting to order at 6:30, and we will start off with public comment. I see we have a few folks in the room and maybe online as well. And just to make sure, we do also have a packed agenda, so I'm gonna have my little handy timer going to keep everybody to 2 minutes. Is there anyone who would like? Sure. And then just as also as a reminder, please make sure to state your name and town for the record.
My name is Richard Shear, and I am from Montpelier, and my son Gabriel is on the first ultimate Frisbee team and recruited Ann Watson to coach. I'm here tonight with a real simple proposition for the schools, and that's that the city of Montpelier is right now considering locations for the recreation center. And I'm asking that the school at least offer up as an alternative an area next to the high school that would allow for the synergy of that facility and the high school. Right now, the present rec center is being overused by seniors because it's proximate to the senior center. During the day, up on the edge of town, it would be seen by just a small number of parents of small children. Here, you have the opportunity for a full gymnasium. And all you have to do is have it open at nights and allow for parking and on weekends. And I'm just saying, you don't have to make the decision, oh, we want it up here, but just tell the city that at least we would be open to consideration. And that didn't take 2 minutes. But I would love for the school board to step forward because it would be a fantastic resource, potential resource. And again, I'm not asking for any kind of commitment whatsoever, except for to contact Bill and say, could you at least look?
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, okay, that's all. Thanks much.
Just our practice and actually procedure is not to, we don't respond to public comment in meetings. So we just listen and express gratitude for you showing up.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any other members of the public who want to? Okay. Moving on to the consent agenda then. I move that we approve the consent agenda. Yeah, second.
Second.
Any discussion?
I would just like to appreciate the principal's report and Shani's
Super, they wouldn't have reported.
this is reveals how I'm feeling at this point in the day. But thank you. It's just really to hear all the exciting things happening in the school. There's just like a lot of positive things to celebrate and just kind of peeking into like the classrooms and student experiences, you know, bringing us in there with you. It's just really great. Appreciate, you know, I think there's some administrators that maybe don't get in the trenches and appreciate knowing that you're getting much of schools.
Any other discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Oh, I'm not supposed to vote. Any opposed? Okay, great. So we have one addition to the agenda, which is to just do a quick overview of the rest of the school year for board meetings. So the plan for the school board is to hold one of our retreats more early-ish in the summer if we can, given, you know, our schedule, if our schedules line up. And then the second one to be closer to the end of the summer to the start of the coming school year. And that the retreats would be, the first retreat would be to finally and fully land our priorities, indicators of success, and then goals for, you know, relative short term, like 1 to 2 year goals. And then the second retreat would be to set up the work plan that would, for the board, that would facilitate us getting to those goals. So I wanted to share with the board what the rest of our board meetings look like to get us to the point where we can have that conversation at the first retreat. And what we'll be covering in the next upcoming board meetings with keeping in mind anything that the board needs to know in order to be able to land our priorities and indicators of success. And then also ask my fellow board members if there's anything missing from this list of this schedule that we should try and work in. So are you able to share your screen so it goes up there? See if we can make it bigger.
Hold on.
Is the agenda planning document?
Yes.
Yeah,
the
you all
yearly-
have this. Yeah.
Right, school board yearly calendar or, board yearly board calendar. So it's also kind of shocking to see how few meetings we have left until the end of the school year. But, right, so for tonight's meeting, we have the special ed presentation. Then in 2 weeks, we'll have the audit presentation, the results from the needs assessment. We have presentation from Jim Birmingham on our our food service. We're going to be doing an equity training, which is and now I've lost what the dates are, but I think that's sometime in May.
The second meeting in May.
Mid-May, yeah. Which will be around what the board's role is in closing the academic gap, which is actually one of our priority areas. And then at the end of May, the middle school sustainability leadership group has asked to do a presentation to the board. And then the June meeting, which happens, I think, mid-June, I think it's June 14th, is when we will get the last of the data presentations for the school year from our administrators. So all of those are keeping in mind the themes that we've already identified for priorities for the board and the district, closing the academic gap, a community or an environment that fosters belonging, safety, and wellness, and community engagement. Those are our three main themes. And with those in mind, this is what we've laid out so far, but also wanted to throw it out to board members to note if there's anything more that you would want to include in the lead up to the board retreat in order to be able to land our priorities and indicators of success. And you don't have to answer tonight because we're just putting all this out there in front of you right now. But if, as you think about that question more over the next couple of days, please email Jim, Libby, and myself so that we can try and work it in. But also, if you have any thoughts right now, I'm happy to hear them and write them down and take note and see how we can. Like the ones that are there?
Yeah, it's looking pretty good.
I just want to say. April 27th is the deadline to email letters of interest. I have my email address there and also Montpelier's email address. So they can, they can send it to any of you and you can forward it to me. And I'll compile a list and then we'll be reviewing those letters of interest on May 3rd. And then ultimately making an appointment, 2 appointments.
How did those openings become known to students?
So Matt McLean is, what is his?
The director of flexible pathways. He is very high school, at high school, yeah, he's very tied to the students. And does a lot of this work with the kids, so I'm sure you're running an email blast to students.
I believe.
And in the songs lives and.
Yeah. I don't know if it's been in the Gator News yet, so I'll check the most recent Gator News. But it goes out into all of the school newsletters. It goes out directly to students via their email addresses. it went out to, leadership of student groups so that they could potentially, let the students from their groups know. But if you have any other ideas of how it should be put out there, I'll make sure to get that document to all the board members. That was an oversight on my part.
All right, thanks. And then, yeah, if other requests or ideas for information come to you after this meeting's over, don't forget, just send us an email. That's my work.
There's a policy recommended by the Vermont School Board Association acquired. And it's parent and family engagement related to Title I schools, and it's really, really massive. And it includes 30 different areas with prompts for community engagement and how that might happen. And we've talked about a community engagement committee, and it's so large and it's so comprehensive that it will, for us to adopt the policy, once we finally get there, it's going to take a lot of collaboration with a lot of different levels in the school district. And I don't know if there's a place or a process in a board meeting or another way to sort of begin to sort of consider how, because it's going to require potentially, and it's the community engagement committee that we talked about will probably be required to monitor all of the actions that are required by the state or by the school board association. So I'm not sure where it fits into board meetings, but it's a massive undertaking. And I think we do a lot of this. And this would formalize some of those processes. But I think it's going to take a lot of collaboration. So I don't know whether that fits in a board meeting or whether it's only a discussion of a new committee or repurposing of current communities or what that might look like. But
It sounds like we could use time at the retreat when talking about community engagement, since we've already named it as a priority, to figure out what that looks like. That's what we would be, maybe we would use the policy as, you know, to help ground our indicators of success or something like that.
I think it'll guide us well. Is it okay if I just share the link to the whole board of the draft?
Well, the policies will go through there's a process for that, right? So.
You just need for information purposes only, just so we can all take a look at it.
Just so we
Just not. to
You know,
share.
maybe share with them just to keep the open meeting, make sure that we're not violating open meeting.
Yeah.
Share the link from VSBA.
Yeah.
That's to the model policy.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, just for people's information, we have 3 required policies. This is not on our agenda tonight, so we're kind of going off on a tangent.
All right, I'm just trying to bring us back.
Yes, I think I think we're in pretty good shape working on it, at drafting it in
Yeah.
the policy committee, but I think working on it at the retreat or discussing it is a good idea.
Yeah, yep. Okay, and so in order for us to be able to do that effectively, it does sound like it would be useful for board members to read even the draft model policy from VSBA. So that would be great. Thanks, Brett. Okay, so let's move on to Peggy Sue. You're up. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Okay, so I tried to put together some information about special education to kind of give an overview and provide some detail, but not too much detail. So hopefully this meets what you all were hoping, or what you were looking for. Whoops. So Libby, you're going to be my Vanna.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, you can skip that one. Okay, so when we think about students with disabilities, there are 3 federal laws that that encompass most of the work that we do, and so I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but I wanted to just identify what those are. So we have IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That is what special education rules fall under and laws fall under. That was reauthorized in 2004 and most recently amended in 2015.
There's the section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then the American with Disability Act of 1990. And so I'm going to just briefly talk about those to just put some context. Next, oh, there we go, thanks. So IDEA is, oops, I gotta do it on my screen too. Because I can't see that. Is an entitlement law that provides individuals with rights to receive a benefit from the law. So a quote from the law, which I think just kind of summarizes its purpose. Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the rights of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. So again, this is where the federal laws around special education services come, and we'll talk more about that. The next law, section 504, is something that actually started because of Vietnam vets, and it's an anti-discrimination law, and it's really about making sure that we're not discriminating against people with disabilities, and we're making sure they have equal access to participate in and benefit from any programs that receive federal assistance. And then ADA, which came in 1990, is also anti-discrimination and basically extended those protections to include things that don't necessarily require or get federal financial assistance. So those are the three federal laws. So in Vermont, we have the Vermont special education rules, that are taken from the federal law. We have to follow the federal laws at a minimum. And then in Vermont, there are some things that are obviously different that I'll talk a little bit about. These rules were most recently updated in July of last year, although some parts have been delayed and will be implemented this coming July because there was a concern in the field that people weren't ready for the changes, some of the changes. So those rules were open because the funding for special education had changed, so they had to open them up for that. And when they did that, there were opportunities for public comment and also the people at the Agency of Ed to think about best practices and things that had been learned since the last time they were opened. And so there were a lot of changes that were made. Some of the most significant changes were around special education eligibility. So there's a lot of change around what specific learning disability looks like and determining that. That isn't coming in effect until July this year. There are some changes around adverse effects, and I'm going to talk about these things more in detail, which also is not until July. They changed the definition of specially designed instruction and who can provide it. That one is currently in effect. Functional skills has been added as a basic skill area, and we'll talk about that more as we go through. And there are also more specific opportunities for parental input. So parents obviously have always been a big part of it, but now there are specific places where you're documenting clearly the input of parents. So specially designed instruction, that is really what special education is about. This is the definition of it. I'm not going to read it all to you, but the two parts that I want to highlight is that the purpose of specially designed instruction is to address the unique needs of the child that results from their disability and to ensure access, that child has access to the gen ed curriculum. So that they can work towards meeting the same standards that all students should be meeting or asked or hope that we're hoping to have them meet. Okay. So how does a student become eligible for special education in Vermont? Currently, there are 3 gates. I don't know where the word gates came from, but that is how we tend to talk about it in Vermont that need to be met for a student to qualify for special education. So we have to look at disability, we have to look at the adverse effect of that disability, and then is there a need for specialized instruction? So the first gate is, does a child have a disability? This is a list of the categories of disability that are in the federal and the Vermont rules. With each of these categories, there are specific criteria and questions that you need to answer to make that determination around whether or not a child qualifies under this disability category. I did put a note on here. There's a lot of conversation around dyslexia. Dyslexia is listed as one of the conditions that fall under specific learning disability. So if a child is diagnosed with dyslexia, their special education paperwork is going to say specific learning disability because that's what the category is in the Vermont reg. So they're, for the purpose of special education, they're kind of the same terms, but the term that is used in the regs is specific learning disability. So if a student has a disability, then a team needs to decide, does that disability have an adverse effect on their educational performance? Currently in Vermont, and I say currently because it's changing after July, the way that adverse effect is defined is you have to look at the lowest 15th percentile rank. It gets into a lot of things. Lowest 15th percentile rank compared to same grade peers in at least one basic skill area. These basic skill areas are up there that you can show with 3 pieces of evidence, 3 different pieces of evidence, and there are 6 categories of evidence. It's a very it's a lot, but anyway, that's what it is right now. So right now we have to look at compared to other students in the same grade, is there an adverse effect, and it's demonstrated by this. After July 1, the 15th percentile rank is going away. There's no longer a specified number of pieces of evidence you need, nor is there specified types of evidence you need. Functional skills is being added as a basic skill area. So right now, when you look at the basic skill areas, they're all academic in nature. Functional skills is one that's being added. And reading fluency is being removed from this list after July. The reason reading fluency is being removed is because right now in the regs, reading fluency can only be looked at for a basic skill area if the primary disability is specific learning disability. After July, specific learning disability is no longer going to be required to look at adverse effect. So this is where I'm like, how much do I share? Like it gets barely, but anyway. So
Can you say that last sentence again?
no, I don't know. Yeah. So after July,
Yeah,
specific learning disability and actually deaf blindness are 2 areas that the rules have changed. So the teams no longer have to look at adverse effect in determining eligibility.
so it doesn't need that second gate.
It doesn't need a second
Only
gate,
the one.
right? And the
The
first gate, the third gate still to be, yeah.
Okay.
The first gate for specific learning disability has gotten much broader and really like it's the adverse effects is kind of built into the process that you're going to have to do to look at specific learning disability. So that's why that's removed. And so the reading fluency, the reason reading fluency is removed is because right now it's only for a specific learning disability.
And the general idea here is that it's gonna make it a little easier to identify if someone needs.
Not necessarily easier. I think it's just a more, so you mean, why are they pulling away the adverse effect?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So it used to be, there wasn't the 15th percentile rank criteria. It was just, is the disability impact having an adverse impact? And so there are lots of ways people looked at it. And I think they were trying to make things more consistent across schools with less room for interpretation. So they put this 15th percentile rank in, and they talked about functional skills also needing to be considered, but not as a separate area. And so their goal of being more consistent didn't actually happen because I think some people were really hard and fast with 15th percentile and didn't necessarily, people interpreted the functional skills part differently. So I think their goal of being more consistent actually didn't end up being more consistent. And so I don't know why they're going back. But that's kind of the history of it, because we didn't have 15th percentile. Vermont is one of the only states that had that, so that was like more restrictive than the federal definition and guidelines. And so I think maybe they're trying to align more with the federal guidelines.
I'll just add in that this is a significant shift for our special educators and psychologists and who've been doing training. For the woman named Jen Patno and the rest of the state for the last, for you, and for here, for
We were just talking about it.
for across this spring, winter and spring, but it is a significant change for our special education department. And I will also say that the agency of education has not provided much guidance as to how to do this change, which is the reason why those organizations bring to me. Because I think there was a.
And we're offering it as a recorded option as well. If anybody needs to access it, they can purchase it.
So I think I heard you say that Vermont used to not have the 15% and that most states also don't have it.
Right.
And so I'm just curious, what about it is so significant for?
Because of the different way to identify students.
So wait, can I answer this? Because there's two big significant, one of the things is the adverse effect that's really significant. The other really significant change is the way that specific learning disability is looked at, which is a lot of what we've done in those trainings. So there has been an option, and many places in Vermont used what was called the discrepancy model. So you looked at a student's cognitive level, you looked at their academic achievement level, and if there was a gap of a certain range, then you said that because of this discrepancy, that a student had a specific learning disability. Now they're taking that discrepancy model away. So it used to be plug the numbers into the computer, figure, that now no longer is an option. And so the wording is around, and I don't know the exact wording of the law, but basically what we're looking at now is looking at cognitive patterns of strengths and weaknesses and or a response to intervention model to look at learning disabilities and determine that. And so that requires us to look at, it becomes a little grayer in a sense, which again, but it's more, I would say it's probably more genuine to really understanding children and how they learn and digging deeper into the way their brains work versus being able to give tests and plug in numbers and make a thing. So that I would say is the biggest change probably is that for a lot of districts in Vermont, especially districts without school psychologists, that's a big change. We are so happy to have school psychologists next year because she is going to be critical in making sure that we're doing this in a way that, with her expertise, it's going to be great. So that is a big change. And then the adverse effect part is a big change because it's not as clear cut with that, just that, again, that mathematical. And
the board will recognize the response to intervention piece that we have to show evidence of that. So all the work we've been doing around the tier 3 in particular systems, particularly our elementary schools, is going to be key, really key to this process.
Right. So if in order for us to determine that a student has a specific learning disability, we have to essentially prove that they had really good first instruction, that they had additional, like a second dip of that first instruction, that then we did intervention, that then, that they're not responding to all of these things and that our interventions are getting more targeted and more focused on how they learn as individual students.
Yeah, for those of you who've been on the board for a while, that should sound familiar. Right, that's what we've been working to create.
Two quick questions. Yeah. Am I picking up on that this is a challenging but not necessarily bad change overall? Are we happy with this change? Are special educators happy with this change, or is this problematic?
I don't think it's problematic. I think it's a different way of working. And I think there is a concern, not because they don't want to meet kids' needs, but that there's going to be a significant increase in the referrals, which we already have this year. And also, so the grayer things are, the more difficult it is to make sure that we are, following what we need to follow, kids are getting what they need to get. It's just, I think it's uncomfortable because it's new and people want to make sure that we're doing it right. And one of the things that's interesting is the state hasn't said you need to do it this way. They said you can choose by the district. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be more consistency between school districts, because every district is kind of figuring out how they're going to do it.
And then my other, thank you.
Yeah.
My other just quick question was, does this have any impact on students that are already at some point in their education? Like, do students that are already under a plan, for example, have to have it revisited? And
No. So, when you receive special education services, there's a requirement that every 3 years you have a reevaluation to determine if there's still that need of service. So as people's reevaluation dates come up, there could be a change in what that process looks like for students. And part of what the new law also says is there's more ability to say, like, we already know this kid has a disability, we don't need to keep checking that part. So it's really that conversation about needs. So there might be less repeat of testing that we've probably done every 3 years for a while, because now we can look and say, yep, we still all agree that based on the way they're presenting in school, that this disability category makes sense. So now we just need to talk about, is there still a need for specialized instruction? Okay. So there we go. The third gate is that need question. So if a student has a disability that is adversely impacting their educational performance, then the team talks about for day 3, is there a need? Do they require something specialized that's not provided through the system of supports for all students? And so if they say, if a team says yes to all 3 of those gates, then a student is eligible for special education. And then there's a note, which we already talked about, just that after July, that specific learning disability and deafblind no longer have to look at adverse effect. The specific learning disability, it's more built in, and deafblind, I think it's just a no-brainer. Like, if you're deaf and blind, there's likely an adverse effect and you're going to need some special education. So once that happens, then a team gets together to develop an individual education program or an IEP. IEPs are developed as a team. There are required team members, and that's the list there. So you need a special educator, classroom teacher, your caregivers, obviously, the student, when appropriate, an LEA representative, which is someone from the school district who can make decisions about resources, and then related service providers, as appropriate, and other people with knowledge. So if there are other people that the caregivers or that work with the student that the team feels like would be important to have their input, then they would come to the meeting. IEPs are reviewed at least annually and updated. There are several components to IEPs. So you talk about the present level. So what is the student educational performance? What do they look like functionally? What is the impact of their disability? What are their strengths, their needs? If there's medical information that's important for teams to know. And this document is really about creating a plan that is information for anyone working with the students in the schools, as well as obviously the parent, but really, making sure that this is information so that someone working with the student has a good picture of the student and the impact of their disability. There is a new parent input section that is on the IEP that's currently started. That started last July. That is just a place to really be clear about what the parents want to make sure is in that plan. And then you identify goals and objectives for the student, and then think about what services the students needs in order to meet those goals that have been identified. We talk about accommodations and modifications. I'll talk a little bit more about what those are. And then for students who are turning 16 or older, there's a post-secondary transition plan requirement. So we have a requirement to work with students in high school in identifying what they want to do after high school, and then looking at what do we need to do while they're in high school to help them work towards those goals. And so there's a requirement around making sure that we are working with community partners and that kind of stuff to make sure that students are set up for what they want to do after high school, which not many 15-year-olds know what they want to do. So that's always fun to work on those plans. There's also an independent living component part of that. So it's looking at education, at work, and then at independent living. And so really making sure that we are providing students what they need. And then, I just made a note that when we're thinking about IEPs, that we're really thinking and identifying the impact of the disability. That's what we're really looking at and trying to address through an IEP. Questions about that? That's a lot. Just a couple key terms to think about within special education. So we talk about accommodations a lot. Accommodations are how a student is going to access the curriculum and demonstrate their learning. So they're about removing the barriers that are preventing the student from fully accessing that. So examples might be untimed assessments, getting copies of class notes, having less problems on a math page, something like that. So it's really about the access. Modifications are about changes to what the student is expected to learn. So accommodations are not looking to change what is happening as far as the content. Modifications could mean that we're changing what we're asking the student to learn. So a couple examples, like if a class is working on writing paragraphs to express themselves, an individual student might be working on writing a sentence to express themselves. Or classes learning like standard units of measurement for weight and length, and an individual student could be learning heavy versus light, long versus short. So looking at what is the grade level expectation, and then kind of backing that out to where is the student right now, and making sure that that's how they're accessing that content. And then least restrictive environment is something that is in something that is in special education law. And it basically says that students are required to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the fullest extent possible. A child with a disability should not be removed from education in their age-appropriate classroom solely because of the need for modifications. So just because they're not learning exactly what's being taught in that class is not a reason that then they should be pulled from those classes. So important note with least restrictive environment, we always start with the regular classroom, but that's not the least restrictive environment for all students based on what their needs are and what we need to provide them. Yes.
How does this work? So with like my kids are in elementary school, so with specials, right? How do the teachers for specials integrate into the IEP, or is there integration of them into the team?
So all of the teachers who work with students get copies of IEPs, and generally it's near to impossible to get every teacher at a meeting. And so special educators would be reaching out to teachers ahead of time to get their input if there was something specific that they felt like they needed to make sure we talked about in the meeting. But all of the special teachers have those and have the obligation to do the accommodations and modifications as required. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then I mean, imagine the complexity of scales as you get into middle and high school.
For sure. Well, even elementary school, right? Like just the number of kids with plans gets pretty, yeah. I have some thoughts in my brain of how to help. We've been talking a lot on our leadership team about our North Star being a list of things that happen in every single classroom and MRPS that we can like guarantee like every single teacher does all of these best practices, and therefore these things don't have to be in plans, so that then the plans actually are smaller and more manageable. But we'll get there. Okay, so switching gears a little, section 504, we talked about, that's the anti-discrimination law. People who are protected under section 504, people who have or are suspected of having. So if we believe somebody has a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Those are the people that are protected. And this is not just a school-based thing. This is, we have many section 504 plans for students, but this is a workplace law as well. So mental or physical impairment, we don't often, there's not a lot of testing necessarily done by the school districts around section 504 plans. Generally, we are getting information from PCP for physicians or counselors or things like that about students coming in. Not to say that there aren't times when we do assessments for that, but generally it's often information we're getting from some outside provider. There is a team decision-making process around this. but it doesn't have the, like, you have to meet every year, although it's best practice and we do that, but there's not all of the strict, procedural things necessarily that special education has. Substantially limiting is not defined in the law. The Office of Civil Rights is the agency that oversees this law. And they have given us something to consider. They say that the effect of the impairment on the major life activity is measured by comparing the individual's ability to that of an average person in the general population. Major life activities are everything from learning to using the bathroom to reading, like the list. I don't know what's not a major life activity. Like, it's a really long list of things for people to consider. And so the purpose of a Section 504 plan is to remove the barriers to access. So it's about leveling the playing field. So it's the accommodations we talked about. Students with a Section 504 plan would not have modified curriculum because that would be special education. So this is really about, like, what are the things we need to do to support their access. I put a note on here because I think it's important that you can have a disability or impairment and you may not be protected under this law. And they did note that a student with an impairment who's succeeding in regular education cannot be viewed as substantially limited in the area of learning. So this isn't like a door prize that you get if you think there are a lot of conditions that people may have that may not, that may be considered a physical or mental impairment, but may not substantially limit something enough that you'd be protected under this law. So there still is a process, and the team really needs to consider the impact of that disability to decide if someone's protected under that law. Okay.
Right, any questions?
Yeah, it's something that's not defined by law. Does that mean that it's gonna be interpreted very differently across districts? And does it mean that?
Welcome to education.
And does it mean that there's disagreement among special educators and disagreement between educators and caregivers? And
Thank you for
and
saying that.
caregivers push really hard if they're of the belief that this is gonna help. And that kind of push somebody over the line to get a 504 because there's no way to rebut it. Or
So there's always a way to rebut it, and we certainly want to work with caregivers. One of the things I should say, Section 504 is actually a general education law. It's not special education. It is about people with disabilities, but it's general education. So we happen to have a special educator at the high school who oversees Section 504, but in the other schools, it's the school counselors that are the 504 case managers. So I just want to say that. And yes, so one of the things that's really important is to have a caregiver be a part of that conversation, because we may not be seeing the impacts in the way that you are at home. And so really making sure that we're having those conversations. One of the things that we ask, so more than once in my 26 years, have I gotten like a doctor's little notepad that just says Johnny has ADHD, give him a 504 plan. That's not helpful. So like what I want to know is, how is ADHD manifesting in Johnny? Like, what are the things that we should be looking for to address? Because that's what we need to figure out, right? Like, so great, he has ADHD, but what does that look like for him? And then what are the barriers that we need to remove? So if we're able to identify barriers, then absolutely we're going to have a plan. I think that yeah, and then, the Office of Civil Rights, not that that's where you want to go, please come see me first. But, if you had some kind of concern or, we're feeling like, this was something that you really felt like your child needed, and, had information that backed that up, then we would have that conversation and figure it out. The other thing that's important to know is that, the SAT company, we have no control over what they do for accommodations. And so a lot of students, when they get to high school, people are looking for them to have accommodations on those tests. And all we can do is send in what we have, and then they make those decisions. Likewise, when you go to college, you can take special education, and it's the day you graduate from high school. Section 504 is something that can go into the workplace and go into, college, etc. But again, that's about what the college decides. Like, us writing a plan doesn't guarantee that that's what's going to happen in college. So sometimes there are more requests in high school, I think, because people are getting nervous about leaving the protections of the smaller place where the kids are known or whatever. And so, yeah, Does that answer your question? Kind of.
I
mean, there's, right, I mean, I think it's the conversation, right? It's, yeah, there isn't a clear, like, the 15th percentile thing, right? Like, that's, but if, I would say, like, we're not going, there's no reason for us not to provide a student a 504 plan if there is a need for it. Like, it doesn't, because there's not services attached to it, like, it's not going to, I mean, there's just, and we, not that that's why we'd make decisions anyway, but like, there's, like, if a student needs that support and that access, we're gonna figure out how to get that to them. I didn't answer your question.
No, I think so. I think
Okay.
so. The difference is the essentially the resources needed to meet the plan. This is something that you can share with a classroom teacher. And you don't need to have a special educator
Right.
necessarily providing the
Right.
instruction or supplementing.
Right. The only types of services that generally that I've seen in 504 plans would be things like, if there's a teacher of the deaf who's providing some kind of consultation or, things like that. But for the most part, there's not generally services. It really is about just the access part.
Got it. Yeah.
And all of these plans also go into any after school, anything that the school facilitates. So if there's students, if your child is on a sports team that's run by the school, then the section 504 plan should be shared and that kind of stuff.
You know what concerns me a little bit about this is the vagueness of the changing, or that things are a little more vague.
That could just be me.
Yeah, no, I think they're loosening up, or they're more open to interpretation is how I'm feeling about what you're describing. And so, we all know that it's expensive, right? And I would really hope that schools, and especially our school, wouldn't cut back on services because we didn't have to provide them, or we could interpret them in a way.
Oh, yeah,
that-
no,
You know what
we're
I'm
not
saying?
doing that. And I guess the other thing I should say is because there are things that districts have to make decisions about. One of the things that we will be doing, we just haven't got there yet, is creating more processes and procedures about this. So in Montpelier, this is how we're going to look at adverse effect. This is how we're going to make determination about specific learning disability. And that's work that the team that's been going to those trainings are going to do. And then with our new school psychologist, we need her expertise in that. So we will be coming up with like procedures around this stuff so that there is some consistency. That's actually something that I've been doing despite all of this, is just trying to create more consistency for families and students. So it's not dependent on which person you're working with or what school you're at or whatever, so that there feels like a more consistent experience, because there aren't necessarily a lot of procedures and processes that go across the district at this point. Okay. I think we're getting there. Okay, so just real quickly, how do they overlap? They're both for students with disabilities. They both focus on the impact of disability. They're both federal laws with protections. And I want to point out that just because a student is behind or struggling doesn't mean they have a disability. And so there are requirements that, well, one, that's why we have our multi-tiered system of support, so that all kids are getting what they need, and it's not based on just those who have a disability. But it's also important, and one of the things that we have to do, especially if we're looking at specific learning disability, is we have to rule out all the other factors before we can say that a student has a disability, learning disability. So things like attendance or disrupted schooling or lack of, first instruction that's high quality. So like, for example, I went to a different school every year until I was in high school. So I missed geography, because there wasn't a consistent curriculum somewhere. So along the way, I missed it, right? So looking at, if we have a student who has been to a bunch of schools, for example, and they're struggling to read, we need to provide them some really clear reading instruction before we're going to say that this child has a disability, so that we can rule out the fact that it isn't that they have a disability, but that they just haven't had the opportunity to learn now. So, that. So, what does special education look like in Montpelier? So we make decisions about student needs and services as IEP teams. We always start with the general education classroom to ask, can we do that specially designed instruction there? If we can, it might look like the special educator co-planning with the classroom teacher and the teacher providing the service. It could look like the special educator and the teacher providing the instruction together. So just examples. Teams talk about, does it need to happen in a separate space due to student specific reasons? And I want to highlight that due to student specific reasons. So if we are pulling kids out, it's not because it works better for the adult schedules, it's because that's what that student needs. So for example, many students need a quiet environment to get that really targeted instruction. So we would think about that. And then we look at, can it be done in a small group or does it need to be individual? So if we're thinking about being restrictive, individual is more restrictive than small group. So if we can do it in a small group, that is our preference. And then what are the skills that the professional who's providing that instruction need to have? So specially designed instruction should be provided by a professional. In the law, it says IAs can do it in rare cases if it's under the guidance of the special educator. Like that doesn't make sense because we need the professionals to be able to in the moment respond to what they're seeing the student provide or give them based on their professional knowledge. So has to be by a professional. And then teams also talk about how much time does the service need to be in order for the student to progress towards the goals that have been identified. A note here, students should not be pulled from their grade level of first instruction for specially designed instruction. So special education is supplemental to first instruction, not a replacement for it.
Just a side note on this, the school board is getting a presentation on our ability challenge to audit. We got a lot of good feedback around this in particular. So you'll hear a lot of where we need to grow and where our opportunities for doing this better at the next board meeting.
Having kiddos stay in the classroom, is that this you're talking about?
This process, like what does specialized instruction look like at MRPS? And where are opportunities to grow our capacity here? We got a lot of really great feedback.
Yeah, so to do this, but that'd be great. So just kind of continuing what does it look like at Montpelier. So we have some students that get the push-in class services, either individually or small group. Some get pull-out services, individually or small group. So those are out of class. We have classes that are co-taught by gen ed teachers with special educators. We have students accessing services through the Sunshine programs, Rise, Shine, and Thrive, which are SEL programs. And then we have students whose least restrictive environment and where they're getting their specialized instruction is in therapeutic independent schools that are outside our district. Currently, the people providing special education services in Montpelier, special educators, math and literacy interventionists are doing services. We have speech language pathologists doing it, and then school social workers, counselors, and other SEL professionals are doing the special education services that are focused on that social emotional learning parts.
I have a clarifying question.
Yeah.
The math and literacy interventionists,
Mm-hmm.
they obviously would be aware of the IEP plan, for example. And do they have special education backgrounds?
So they have specialty in the areas that they're intervening.
Right.
So in some cases, they actually have more specialized training than maybe special educators who are more generalist. And so that's part of the conversation that IEP teams have around like, what is the skill set that someone needs? We try not to pull them too much because if we pull them all to special education, we kind of ruin our great system that Mike and Libby have been working on for the last several years.
Right, having them at the tier 3.
Yeah.
For even kids who don't have a disability.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some of that happening, but that is definitely not what, not what our preference is. And I'm working with Mike and the principals next year and looking at kind of with the change in how special education funding works, really being able to look at even maximizing that more. So there might be special educators providing intervention and, like really looking at how do we maximize the resources that we have in the specialties that we have.
Yeah, just because somebody's a special educator does not mean they're an expert in all the needs a kid has, right? So I have a special education degree. And I would have been considered a great person to work with somebody with reading needs, social emotional learning, or kids with really significant multiple intensive needs. I didn't know much of, like I would not have been your girl for that kind of thing. So That's actually one of the best parts about the law change and the funding change is that we can really match expertise to the people.
The next slide just talks a little bit about related services, just because it's something you've heard. So, in addition to special education services, oftentimes there are students that require related services. And those are services that they need to benefit from their special education services. So, we have students that get occupational therapy support, physical therapy, speech therapy, counseling, audiology, there's a whole list here. If a student only requires a related service, then they cannot be determined to be eligible for special education. So just we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but just so you know. So what's in the works for what I've been doing and working on, like I said, creating systems and processes to try to increase our alignment between schools and practitioners. Working on looking at our allocation of resources to make sure that they're distributed based on student need and not just like we've always had this person at the school, therefore that's where they need to be. PD opportunities, professional development for special educators and classroom teachers around differentiating instruction and growing instructional practices. And then working with Mike and Jess to enhance our MTSS system, so that system of support and providing PD to increase understanding about disabilities. Things that were still to come, opportunities for parent training and involvement, rolling out the needs assessment. So we've been doing that. We're doing that with our staff right now and ahead of it coming out in public and to the board. And then identifying and confirming our priorities based on that information. And I know one of the things that the board has asked for that I'm still racking my brain around is how do we measure overall success for special education? We have a new system called Panorama next year that I haven't gotten into too much, but I'm hoping there's some data thing there that maybe will help with that. And then there were a couple of board member questions I want to address. One was asking why Vermont doesn't require screening of all students for dyslexia. So I did a little bit of research. Sounds like Vermont is one of 10 states that doesn't require it. And I don't know why our legislator doesn't require it, but what I can say is that we have a number of common assessments that we do in Montpelier-Roxbury to make sure that we are looking at developing where students are at in developing their reading skills. So assessments that look at letter sound identification, high frequency words, phonological awareness, developmental spelling. There are a number of things that we're doing to make sure that we are, catching students early if they're struggling with that reading development. There were a number of questions about the role of gen ed teachers with students who receive special education services. This is my new mantra that I'm going to put at the bottom of my email. All students are general education students. Some general education students also require special education in order to fully access their education. So I think that's a pretty strong understanding and belief of people in this district from what I've seen. But that is always really important to clarify that all students start out as gen ed students and then some need a little more.
That's a little tickler from the audit.
Wait, that's my next slide. So classroom teachers have a mandate to make sure that all students have access to the general ed curriculum, regardless of disability. They are required to implement accommodations and modifications as described in IEPs. They are required members of evaluation and IEP teams. Teachers collaborate on a regular basis and co-plan with special educators. So the teachers are more the content experts and the special educators are the access experts. So that's why that co-planning is so important. And then teachers track and provide data about student progress in their gen ed curriculum and share observations about how they see students' disabilities impacting them. And as Libby was trying to say, spoiler alert. So at the next board meeting, the folks from Ability Challenge will be here. And many of the questions that were answered or were asked will be answered through their report. This is what Libby was going to say. One of the quotes that we were really excited about was that the MRPS community is its greatest asset. Leaders and teachers believe in foundational mindsets of authentic inclusion. Students are thoughtful, curious, and eager to learn, and families are incredibly dedicated to ensuring that their children get the services they need. They loved our students. They really enjoyed spending time with our students, which was great to hear. And, you know, I will say that it felt, it was great. The needs assessment was great and really confirmed for our team. I think that we're on the right track with the work that we have identified as priorities. And I always appreciate having data to agree with what I think.
And I was gonna say,
Oh.
we have the belief, the foundational belief
Yes.
of strong inclusion, which is a huge hurdle that we've been working on. And we have a lot of work to do as to how to actually do it. So a lot of capacity building and specialized instruction, and when we give that and what it looks like and that kind of thing. So that, you know, the belief is sometimes the harder part.
Yeah.
Honestly. So I was super excited to see that and we just got really good information. So I'm excited for the board to hear from Kristen and
Sarah.
Sarah. I never remember Sarah's name.
And I have to say, when you get the report, if you print it, for some reason,
That
the
was-
eyes, no, it wasn't. They printed it in the middle school too. Some of the eyes don't print in the report, even though they're on the digital copy. And Paula actually figured out it's after the letter F. Anytime there's an F, for some reason, the I after it doesn't print. So just know that on the report you get, they're all in there, but for some reason, when you print, I don't know.
She's been upset about that.
I had to go through and write in all the I's in my report. It was driving me crazy.
How many pages is this report?
68.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness.
It's great.
You added eyes
Yeah,
after
well,
every,
because I was reading. Yeah, it's just, you know, I had to. All right, I think that was it for me.
thank you very
Questions?
much. Thank you for being here.
Yep.
And I mean, we're gonna ask you to come back, I think in a couple weeks too. There, so appreciate you spending all this time with us
Sure.
to give the board this kind of information. For me, it was really helpful to be able to then make meaning of what we're gonna see in a couple of weeks to have this foundational understanding. So really appreciate the time you put into that. Follow-up questions? From folks? Emma.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot to, I mean, you know, this is a really comprehensive overview of how things function. And I've sat through a lot of trainings as a fly on the wall. And I think that this is really, really well done. So thank you for that. I'm also, you know, one of the notes that I wrote down and then was glad to see in your presentation is some sort of like parental involvement.
Yeah.
I think that anytime that there's a change to how things are done, it can create anxiety for people
Okay.
and concerns. And I think, you know, some of those concerns were brought up by Lynn. You know, it can kind of go either way, like, are too many kids get qualifying, or are we using the discretion to qualify too many kids, or we're using the discretion to like deny kids services? And I think those concerns are going to be raised by the community. And so I think if we can kind of get out ahead of that in some way with, and it seems like you're already thinking about that, but
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to figure out what our procedures are and then, yes, absolutely look for opportunities to share that with parents. Yes, that's, and other practices too, right? Just, there are things this year that, you know, we've discovered, like, this is what happened when I was
Yeah.
last year for me, and it didn't happen this year. So I assume that one of these people isn't doing their job right. And they're both doing their job right, just differently. So trying to get more consistency, so there isn't that feeling of, you know, I mean, this is your children, right? It's your most precious thing. So
yeah.
we want to make sure that parents know that we are there teaming with them, and, you know, we're going to do what we need to do for their kids.
Yeah, and thanks for taking the initiative too. It sounds like developing, you know, district-wide procedures and sort of a clarity and transparency around the way that this district interprets and works within the law is going to be very helpful, I think.
Cool.
Go for it. I feel like when any sort of law change happens, there's a new initiative, it lands in different ways for different people. And I'm curious how these changes, and maybe some of them are anticipated, because it sounds like these have sort of been like way late a year
Yeah.
to kind of get ready. But like, where is there excitement? Where is there like trepidation, you know, in these new, maybe neither of those things exist, but it certainly sounds like it's going to change how you do work, right? So I'm just curious, like, where there might be excitement or trepidation within the special education world. And then most importantly, I'm curious what your opinion on is where these changes are going to benefit students.
So I think that there's some of the things that are exciting, which Libby referenced a little bit, is with the funding changes, with there being more flexible funding around special education, there's more opportunity for us to collaborate and team and really look at how we use all the resources in the school instead of like this student needs special education services, it has to be with a special educator, so like opportunities for really looking at what are the skill sets of our professionals and kind of maximizing our what we are getting from them. That sounds terrible, but you know what I mean. So I think that the kids, yeah, so that's what I mean. Yeah. So I think there's exciting opportunity around teaming. Mike and I have been doing a lot of work together, and Jess, although Jess isn't quite, is more focused on the SEL than the academics, but Mike and I have been thinking about how we can use our academic resources in a way to really maximize opportunities for kids. So I think that's exciting. I think that I'm very excited to have a school psychologist. I had one in my last district, and they just have an expertise that really is crucial. And there's a big difference between contracting with someone who comes in and does testing and gives you a report, and someone who can be at the meetings, who can consult with the teams after and really help people understand how kids' brains are working, or what is the information that they're able to dig in to. I think that the trepidation, I think that people are doing a lot of great work, but not necessarily having documented. Like I think about classroom teachers, there's a lot of documentation requirements around some of this at those levels, that they're doing the work but aren't necessarily documenting. It's just built into how they practice. And so that part probably is going to feel uncomfortable and take some like getting used to, and feeling like they're under a microscope, right? And so I think that that's a hard place for teachers to work, anyone to work, right? If you feel like you're under a microscope and everything you're doing is being judged, and you have to, like, that doesn't feel great. So I imagine there will be some trepidation there with that. I think the functional skills piece is something that's really important. I think there's a lot of advocacy from people with children with autism, because there are a number of people with autism who didn't necessarily hit that 15th percentile academically, the lowest 15th percentile, but that there's a need. And so those needs have been addressed mostly through Section 504, and now there will be more opportunities for direct instruction. So I think that and the SEL world as well. I think that, I think having Jess's position and really having someone be able to focus on building up those support systems is huge and crucial for kids. And so I think that that's great.
So if it seems like this could kind of cast a wider net could be cast by way of these new laws, are you assessing just sort of like the capacity of our existing special education staff to field those potential increases? And are we looking at recommended changes or increases?
I just need to hire people. Libby tells me not to stress yet, but I'm a little stressed. There aren't a lot of special educators out there.
Right.
So
And everybody is looking for them.
everyone's like, I know, it's not just here, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I think that it's not going to all be in place for next year, but I think there are opportunities kind of looking more long-term around specialization. So if there becomes a point where special educators are hard to find, then do we look at having them do like someone specialize in just the case management piece, and then we find people that are math and literacy intervention, like are there are other ways that we can be flexible to make sure that student needs are getting met. So thinking about that stuff for sure. Right now, trying to think about ways that people can collaborate more, and like who are the resources that we have right now, without trying that first and trying to fill in those empty vacant spots that have been vacant all year.
And we're gonna have to have some hard conversations around delivery model. And is it working? Is it effective? Or do just the adults like it? How do we provide the services that we need, like case management services and specialized instruction with what we have, which is what Peggy Sue was just referencing. And there are gonna be some hard conversations, most definitely, with our staff and leaders around how to make this possible. Because we can't conjure up people out of thin air, like we have.
We're
what we
trying.
have. Yeah. We have what we have and we'll continue to search and all that kind of thing, but we have what we have, so we gotta do the most we have with it. So there'll be some hard conversations. There'll be conversations around the co-teaching at Union Elementary School. Can that continue based on the needs that we see from kids? That's gonna be very hard for us to have for both the community and the teachers. But they're just where we are right now.
And I think the other thing that we're looking at, and people have been great, the leadership team has been great about this, is it's not like we've always had this number of special educators in high school, therefore that's what has to be here. It's like looking at where are the numbers of kids right now and where do we need to shift people so that we're not burning out the wonderful people that we have.
And we've had to make more shifts this year than we ever have in my 10 years.
How do kids for English as second language fit into this? And do you provide services for them, or does that funding come from somewhere else? And how
So
many kids do we have?
I think we have around 50 something, yeah. We have 3 teachers whose focus is working with those students. They don't fall under special education unless they also have a disability. But and there are sometimes where that happens, which is always tricky to tease out, but there's lots of great guidance around that. So there are 3 teachers that have caseloads that work on supporting those students. I work with them some. It is definitely not my area of expertise. They are the experts and tell me what they do, which is great. I think that with them, again, it's about many of the things that we could support classroom teachers with will also be helpful for students that English is a second language for. So, they're looking for opportunities to also provide coaching to teachers, and, they're often planning with teachers as well around accessibility from their lens and their angle versus the accessibility based on disability. But the funding is totally different. I don't actually think there's much funding specific, like,
We'll have Scott be last, and don't forget, we're gonna see Peggy Sue in a couple of weeks. So Scott will go last, and then we'll move on to our next agenda item.
Thanks. I'm curious, so there's a slide, what does special education look like at MRPS?
yeah.
In your opinion, when you look at how we provide special education services here,
Mhm.
what are you like most proud of? What's like really exemplary about special education services at MRPS, and where do you think we really need to, like, where are our growth edges? Where can we really improve?
I think the thing to be most proud of is that every single person I've met is doing what needs to happen for kids. So super flexible staff, super kid focused, really strong special educators. I mean, they've been working all year with 3 less professionals than they should have, and they're, 3 less special educators. So, and not one time has someone said to me, that's not my job, I'm not going to do it. It's like, all right, how are we going to figure this out? How are we going to, make this work? So I think that the commitment and dedication to getting kids what they need is huge. I think that as when I think about what do we need to do, I think it's that specialization thing. It's that next part, and we don't and most people, I don't think I can think of anyone who's not interested in growing as a professional. So it's really helping people figure out how are we going to target professional development for them so that it's increasing whatever area they're interested in and or we need for the district. This year, our focus has definitely been on these rule changes, and unfortunately that's not necessarily about instruction. There's some exciting instruction coming next year. I know about for reading at Union and Roxbury. And I think that the conversations the conversations I've been having with special educators as we kind of wrap up the year is around, so what is your target? What is the area? Where are you looking to grow instructionally? And I think we can all keep growing and learning as new research comes out. And I see that it's an awesome group of people. Like, I'm really happy to be able to work with them all. They're great. And I get to see them every week, and it's all about kids. It's never about like, nope, I can't do one more. I can't another kid moved in, like that is not what I hear. So I think that that's fantastic. And we can figure out everything else as long as we have that mindset.
Great. Thank you, Peggy Sue.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks again for being here.
Bye.
Good night. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to our Facilities and Energy Committee for the net zero resolution.
Great, thanks. So before you this evening, for the first time, is the draft. I want to say it in full. The draft resolution to set goals for net zero facilities and operations and establish a decarbonization roadmap. I sent an email to the board last week that just gave a little bit of like a historical retrospective and some context of how this came to the board, which I think originally, I'm not sure if it was actually MEAC, Montpelier Energy Advisory Committee. All right, Tim, who Tim Favorite is here, and he is a member of MEAC, and he has been incredibly helpful to the Facilities and Energy Committee in doing this work. So thank you publicly for all the time and energy. We appreciate you. So MEAC has come to the board at least twice during my time, talking about the city of Montpelier's goals around achieving net zero by 2030. MEAC had also commissioned a study that was done by the EIC. The words behind that acronym I cannot recall. However, they did develop an action plan for the city around achieving net zero. The heating systems at MS, and MHS were named as target, kind of priorities to hit that 2030 goal. We also heard from the Montpelier High School Earth Group in the spring of 2021, I believe it was, and they made a direct request to the board to adopt a net zero policy. So those, in my time, have been kind of the primary, drivers, for the board to really kind of take this up and take a look at it. And it's taken us a minute to get to this work, as I think the Earth Group came to the board at the time when the Facilities and Energy Committee had just been created. So we've been kind of getting our bearings and centered this work really in the last 6 months or so. And after looking at a lot of resources out there and looking at how different school districts really from around the country were taking on net zero, fossil fuel transitions, decarbonization, et cetera. One way that they were kind of starting that work was to write a resolution that kind of helps define the way forward. It kind of prioritizes the work. It sets a plan for what the work is generally going to be. Sends a message to our constituents who are clearly very, this is a topic of interest. We also heard from folks in the thought exchange that was, I think, in December of 2021, there was an infrastructure thought exchange, and we got a lot of feedback from community members that net zero was a priority for them in terms of, our facilities as a district. So we decided to go ahead and write a resolution, knowing that a policy, we weren't quite sure how to go about that because net zero there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be considered. It's not simple, it's complex. So the purpose of the resolution is to really kind of carve out, the way forward and the next steps for the board, while also, making mention of just the context of science, things happening in the city of Montpelier and the state of Vermont, really in the world in terms of climate change and climate emergency, whatever you might call it. So we really kind of tried to mention those things in our preamble, all of the whereases of the resolution. And then within the resolution, we get into, setting that, that goal of net zero facilities and operations by 2030. Which, and kind of teaming up with the city, what they're considering net zero is really eliminating fossil fuels as a source for heating and transportation. And then we talk a bit about, hopefully you've all read it. We talk about the need for kind of a decarbonization plan, like a way in which that we would go about, doing this work. We've worked closely with Andrew LaRosa and getting his feedback. And I think something that Andrew has asked of us is, how do I make these decisions? There's many decisions to make in terms of keeping our facilities up and running and up to snuff, and there's repairs that need to be made. How do I go about making a decision and pulling in, the net zero goal piece? Like, he's asking for some guidance from us to do that, because there are dollars and cents attached to all of those decisions. So in this resolution, it really just kind of carves the way for us to do that work in developing a framework, a roadmap, and also kind of like a tool, sort of like similar to the equity policy review tool that, if there's a certain decision before, facilities, would a decision made kind of, check the boxes and be aligned with the net zero goals of the district. So that's what we've been talking about creating. In developing this, we also were sure to get feedback from the Student Earth Group, we had comment from Sam Lash from Community Vermont Regional Planning Commission, I believe it is. And so she's also been very helpful with us in just giving guidance and also providing the context around funding opportunities. I think we're not talking about things that are cheap in terms of making changes. So Sam has been helpful to us to let us know kind of what the funding landscape is looking like right now and grant opportunities, so that, when it comes to the time that we're talking about making these changes, how could they be supported by outside funds that are not taxpayer dollars? So, and yeah, we really just wanted to get it before you all tonight to get some feedback and response and direction. And we have it on the agenda, I think for the next meeting, but then I also saw it on the, I think the May meeting with the sustainability student group, which does kind of dovetail nicely. But for tonight, we just really want to get some initial impressions and feedback on the draft resolution.
Great. Thank you. Open it up for any comments or questions?
I want to give a huge shout out to Kristen for leading our committee in this work. She's done a really amazing job, and it's something that's sort of been, discussed by the community and by students for a very long time now. And to see the type of progress we've been able to make since you've been sort of at the helm is really impressive. So thank you so much for your work. And also Tim has been really like an honorary extra committee member attending
all the glamour that comes with being
member.
Yeah.
So really good props to you for
that.
It's been bringing a lot of expertise to our
Yeah.
discussion and helping answer lots of questions and attending every meeting. So it's really,
That's huge.
He deserves a huge thank you for all of that work.
It's good to be optimistic.
Well, what's the biggest dollar punch to the net zero? What's the big one? Or two or three? I mean, heating systems. And
Yes, heating systems. So
for all the schools, or no, I guess RVS is heat pumps, it's nice.
Yep. Yeah, currently, I mean, was identified in the VEIC report, the net zero action plan for the city or the oil-based heating systems at Montpelier Main Street Middle School and then Montpelier High School. In the report, there was two strategies, that could be looked at. There was the idea of doing some wood boiler systems, and then there was also ground source heat pump systems. Interestingly, it does seem like there is some backing away from the idea of wood chip boiler systems, just the general kind of discussion and narrative around them. Folks are walking back from that, is this a sustainable source, looking at the carbon emissions piece, does it really balance out? So it seems like the trend in the sector is definitely like electrification is like a lot of what's, being talked about. So like heat pumps, is like kind of the new technology. So I'm not a professional in this, I'm a, what do we call that? Armchair quarterbacker. So I think we're all learning, and that's also what's in here, is that in this process that we would have, a committee that would take it on to really learn about this, so that a sensible plan could be made. And there has been a lot of discussion of like time moves on, so the technology changes over time. What worked, however many years ago, we didn't have seatbelts, now we have seatbelts, right? We have airbags. So it's the technology keeps changing. So, that's certainly a part of the discussion, because this is, would be a financial investment wherever, the money comes from. So, but 2030, sorry, was, really, we trying to stay kind of in sync with the city of Montpelier that established a 2030 goal. So that's where that came from.
And the other big piece was sort of mostly twofold. It was like heating systems and transportation.
Yes.
So our buses being electrified somehow. So we'll have to see.
I mean, the Inflation Act,
Yes.
does that have a time frame? Because that was a tremendous amount of
Yeah.
federal resources that I don't know. But
Tim,
there's a lot of resources.
because that is what Sam has been saying, that there's a lot of funding kind of packed inside of that is could be accessible.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of money coming out in the next, couple of years, I believe, that should open up. But like, I think, with Libby and Andrew already found one that seemed promising, and out there, I'm sure there'll be others.
All these buses, or do we contract out?
So the committee is looking for any feedback from the board on the resolution itself to take back to a committee meeting to maybe make some edits.
That's right.
Right.
Oh, I had raised my hand.
Yep.
I think another piece to Rhett's question that I remember hearing Andrew say in the past is there's also a lot of if there isn't just one or two huge things, there's also a bunch of little things that may not seem as glamorous or as obvious, right? Like replacing light bulbs that are a different way, or repairing something and making it last longer, that there are other less exciting moves that could be part of that strategy about
Windows.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And I would say about that, I mean, I think Andrew's made a ton of strides in those departments across the district too. I mean, I know there's been huge lighting retrofits and, and I know that a lot of those are showing up in the facilities, the annual facilities report that he's kind of separating out and putting I forget what he calls it, a green technologies section kind of within that. So we can sort of see, where those conservation measures are being built into facilities upgrades too. So, but yeah, conservation, not as glamorous, but, is also important.
I just had a few comments, which one was the goal is really impressive, strong and ambitious, and I think that's great. And I think it makes sense because that it's aligned with what the city of Montpelier is doing, since 3 of our buildings are located inside of Montpelier. I also really appreciate that you have defined what net zero looks like for us, because that's often been the question that gets raised when people come to us and say, we need you to get to net zero. or we need you to work toward zero, net zero. And for us to be able to say, this is what it looks like for us, even if it's not, what some other district or some other entity would define it as. I think it has like to define it for us gives us the thing to be working toward, which is really, really helpful. One of the questions that I had while I was reading it that I think is answered at the end was just how we're going to hold ourselves accountable into what we're doing. But I think one of the resolutions has the, at least annually, we will be monitoring our own progress. So I appreciate seeing that. And then I also had a question about how it impacts our budget, which I realize is not possible to answer today, but I wonder if it's worth working it into the resolution somehow. I don't know, just to acknowledge that we don't have all of the money that it would take to pay for these things right now. And maybe we never will. I don't know, like that's a tricky part of doing this, and feels like maybe worth including in the resolution somehow to talk about, acknowledge the financial piece.
I think one area that we address it somewhat, and you can, tell me if it wants to be more, because I get it that is a glaring reality, right? Is the cost of which, and the fact that our budget relies on taxpayer money. In the second, be it resolved, we talk about just changes that would be made, be made based upon reasonability within budgetary. It mentions that, so doesn't really get specific beyond that. However,
Right.
that is an important variable in any kind of decision making. Yeah, I've made a note. I'll think about it. Yeah.
I don't think it says anything about external funding.
Does
it?
I thought we had put that in there. I think we had in a whereas section, the last whereas, whereas as of 2023, there are unprecedented federal funding opportunities available for energy infrastructure upgrades. So we name that the funding environment right now is more flat than usual. But let me go back through and see. External funding.
I mean, I think that's.
Yeah, a pursuit of, yeah. Mhm.
In terms of where we are now, how do we move forward and take advantage of that funding? You know what I mean? Because it's not gonna be there forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew's always on the lookout, and the Agency of Education with Jill Briggs Campbell, who's one of our parents. You're lucky to have her as one of our parents, gives us the heads up as well when the state learns of. She works at the Agency of Education in this world, and she gives us a heads up.
And grants are coming along.
Yeah, she's awesome.
And you feel like you're at a point, or maybe this is a question for Andrew, I don't know, but that if that kind of funding comes up, we can jump on it and.
Andrew's very good at that. So what Tim was alluding to was a monster grant opportunity that we learned about in a meeting, and I think Andrew had a proposal for it within a week to get out there. So he's pretty quick like that. Yeah.
Great.
We didn't get it, however.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Questions or input? You look like you have a thought.
I know,
Scott.
something's brewing.
I have a question that is related, but not specifically to this.
Okay.
And so I want to hold it to the end and then maybe pop in.
The end of the whole meeting?
No, the end of this.
This part of the
conversation.
agenda. I think we're there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're there.
So I'm thinking about like the landscape of the role of a board. And I understand what a policy is and does, but what is a resolution? And
Yes. We have wondered the same, because I think according to Jim, like this may be a first. Time, at least in time
Yeah, I don't know.
memorial, that a resolution has been created by the board. And again, we kind of looked at literally nationwide, different, there was more resolutions than there were policies, adopted by school districts. So, I mean, my sense is that, right, like if it's a policy, there's going to be compliance reporting, it's binding, whereas I feel like the resolution is like making a value statement, and for this, the purpose is here really setting a direction for the work, and being clearly articulating, what these kind of next steps are and how we as a board are going to work to carry that work forward kind of in response to, community members. So I think there probably is a bit of honor system, in this. And, that we have a facilities and energy committee, and that this, will be on the work plan of that committee to keep it going forward. And that's why we did build in like an annual, again, it's going to be honor system, but an annual, update for the board, where we're at in achieving this goal. So I don't know, there could just be, it's new territory.
I see it as a first step too. It's like,
Yeah.
this is us, committing to this as a value and to work towards it. And then if it doesn't seem like we're on track, then maybe a policy would be in order, eventually.
Seems like a good guiding principles kind of for us to keep in mind when we're making our decisions and choices.
Merritt?
No question.
Great.
Were any of the like school environmental groups, like the high school work group, like conferred with about the
Yes.
resolution? Okay.
Yeah, so I went to an Earth Group meeting and kind of just gave them an overview on where we were at in the process. And then the draft resolution was provided to them to review. They gave us some written feedback, and they were also invited to kind of like a reviewer meeting where folks just around the table kind of shared, their feedback. And we had 2 members attend that meeting. And then I also gave the second resolution to those folks. And I did share it with Tom Sabo, who's the coordinator for the Earth Group. And I did it today, which I meant to get it to him last week. It just got lost in the shuffle. But we do have additional time to hear from. It's not being, it's not up for approval tonight, but I'll follow up with Tom again to make sure that for sure they've seen it.
Yeah, great house. Well,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
was feedback, right? But it sounds like there was. So.
Yeah.
Also the, really the origin story of the work that started with the board kind of, I'm sure there were rumblings about it prior to that big Earth Group presentation. But when the student group presented to us, how many years ago?
It was March of 2020. I think it was my first meeting, or
2
second
years ago.
meeting. So yeah, 2021.
So when that presentation happened, I feel like that was really the impetus to move this work forward more quickly. So I would attribute the momentum around this topic directly to the students that gave that presentation that day.
So I think the next step then is to take any feedback, and then, we may be coming back to the next meeting for approval. So anything between now and then, please follow up with us, and we'll get it to you in advance of the next meeting.
Great. Thank you again.
Yeah.
For the great work. Okay, so now we're moving on to monitoring 2 policies, the one on budget execution and the one on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this requires board action to approve the monitoring reports. Have a motion?
I move to approve the 2 monitoring reports.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Right? Any discussion?
I want to,
Yep.
sorry. I just want to thank Libby again for just sort of an honest assessment of the diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
Policy, and being willing to say that we have work to do there, publicly in that capacity. So I appreciate. Thank you, Tim.
And remind us of things we have done, like the,
Yeah.
support we gave to the statewide
Mhm.
waiting work, equitable waiting work.
Yeah, and giving very specific detailed explanation of sort of like what we've done and what we need to do. Yeah. The work that we're going to be doing. So thank you for that.
Kristen, did you have something?
Yeah, in some ways, it was a little bit more of a question or comment for the board, I mean, part of that policy is a board responsibility. In terms of, asks the board to, I think, do like an annual review of policies, like with an equity lens. We haven't done that work in a concerted way. The equity committee did create a policy review tool, but then didn't actually do kind of a full sweep of all the policies. So I was just thinking about that in terms of what pieces does the board need to take on in terms of that piece. And then I think we're also responsible for training, or
We need
right?
to do a training for ourselves.
Right. So, and I know we have one coming up, but so yeah, I was just specifically thinking about the policy review, and this is maybe like a question down the line for the policy committee and kind of where that process is, and maybe a question also for the equity committee of how, do we taking another look at that equity policy review tool and thinking about how that could be kind of leveraged in that process that we have not yet completed or started, for that matter. So,
I will say that we have been using the equity.
great,
Tool.
great.
And we actually just after our last meeting, we decided. And I know we spoke of that tool as being sort of a living document that could be changed. So what we're going to try to do for our next round of required policies that Rhett mentioned, there's 3 of them, is where we transferred that tool into a Google form.
Mhm.
Because we were finding it a little challenging, even just like sort of like little technical formatting issues.
Yeah.
Of like losing the headers while you're typing down below and then having to go back and read the headers. So just stuff like that.
Yeah,
And so
totally.
we put it in, we transcribed it into a Google form to hopefully make it more user friendly, and we're going to practice using it and see how that works out.
That's
But,
fabulous.
But we have been using it. I mean, I will say that to do a full read with that tool of all of our policies would be very, very time consuming. And we've been doing it as we go. So we did it with the library policy, and we did it with the 5 new board policies. And we're doing it now with these 3. So like we're using it as we go.
Mhm.
But if we wanted to make a more concerted effort to go through, all the policies, we might need to start spreading the love into other committees for that work. But so far, I think it's been a helpful tool to start.
Great.
It's a good starting point.
That makes me wonder if it would be worth tweaking the language in the DEI policy a bit to say look at every policy that is up for renewal, when up for renewal, or when
Yeah.
getting written
Right.
through the equity lens, because
Right.
rather
Annually.
than tasking us with gotta look at every single policy annually, unless
That's a
it was
lot.
like, maybe we asked, when you do policy monitoring reports, there were like 3 key questions we asked you to answer that were drawn from that tool or brought in the next.
Doesn't always work out. I mean,
Yeah.
mileage.
Yeah, and like something like firearms also,
Yeah.
right, so that's another reason I wonder if it's worth tweaking the language a bit
Yeah.
to maintain the spirit of what is there, which
Yes.
makes a lot of sense. But not have it be, okay, we haven't looked at every single policy this year, so therefore we're not in compliance with
Right.
this particular policy.
I think that's a great suggestion. The DEI policy is one of the policies that's on our list of priority policies to work on. And it's something that Zach and Merrick have been working on in their tenure as student reps. So they've been sort of honing in on the curriculum piece of it. But I would imagine we're kind of waiting for new guidance from the state on DEI. And once that comes down, I think we'll be ready to take another look at our DEI policy, at which point we could review that piece.
Yeah, the other piece to look at that every year, I'm like, I don't know how to do that, is the self-identifying factors, and how would I report out to the board data around like LGBTQ plus. We certainly don't
disaggregate our reading and math data along that identifying factor, nor could we, so. It's just something else
Yeah.
to think about.
Any other discussion on these policy monitoring reports? All right. All those in favor of approval?
I.
Any opposed? I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Oh, it's a tie. We'll let Anna figure out who said it. Second?
I second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Let's go home. I'm not even gonna ask if you oppose. Thanks, everybody.